In Week 1 of the 2024 season, we got a blockbuster matchup when USC and new defensive coordinator D'Anton Lynn faced off against Joe Sloan, Brian Kelly, and the LSU offense. Though all the coaches just mentioned had a lot of success last year, they all entered 2024 with questions. Lynn's defense at UCLA finished in the top 10 in total defense last year, but USC finished an abysmal 119th, leading Lincoln Riley to go out and hire Lynn in the first place. Heading into 2024, one storyline was always going to be about how much and how quickly Lynn could get the Trojan defense up to speed. Across the line of scrimmage, LSU had a different set of questions. The Tigers lost Heisman Trophy winning quarterback Jayden Daniels to the NFL draft, and with him went two more first-round picks in wide receivers Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr., who combined for more than 2,700 receiving yards a year ago. From the coaching staff, LSU also lost coordinator Mike Denbrock, though Kelly himself was always a major offensive influence on him. To replace Denbrock and maintain continuity with last year's elite offense, Kelly hired two co-coordinators from within the program, with quarterback coach Joe Sloan being promoted to the official play-calling role. In spite of this continuity, however, there was always going to be questions about how this new coordinator tandem would work and how they'd adapt their offense to fit this year's personnel. Each of these units offered the other a tough early season test then, and a chance to address some of these questions early on, and what emerged was a complicated set of answers about the strengths and weaknesses of each team. From USC's perspective, there was a lot to be excited about, as the Trojan D held LSU to just 20 points. That's something that they've done only a handful of times against winning Power 5 programs in recent years, and after finishing outside of the top 100 defensively 2 years in a row, there's gotta be a sigh of relief coming out of Los Angeles. At the same time, the 20 points don't quite tell the whole story, and there were some ways in which LSU's offense picked up right where they left off. They clearly missed the big playability of Daniels, Neighbors, and Thomas, but they were able to do just about anything they wanted in the quick and intermediate passing game. Quarterback Garrett Nussmeier completed more than 76% of his passes for 308 yards and 2 touchdowns, a stat line that might be a little bit surprising for an offense with a completely rebuilt passing game and 2 new co-coordinators. In this video then, we'll focus on the chess match between D'Anton Lynn's coverage calls and LSU's spread ball control passing attack. That's where things develop the most over the course of the game, and so it's the most interesting storyline schematically. A second storyline, though, was USC's near dominance of the LSU ground game, which was mostly redeemed by one 39-yard run. Other than that, the Trojans held LSU's running backs to just over 3 yards per carry, and that played a major role in keeping the Tigers off the scoreboard. If you're interested in that matchup, I've posted a video on it on my new Patreon site at patreon.com/tcpfootball, so you can head over there and check it out if you want. That's also where, throughout the season, I'll be adding bonus content, including film study, as well as historical videos about great coaches from the past and how they've impacted the game. To start analyzing the passing game strategy of each team, we should start with one clear difference between LSU's offense last year versus in this game, and that was a reduced deep play threat down the sideline. In 2023, Jayden Daniels averaged almost 12 yards per attempt in the passing game, but in the USC game, Nussmeier threw for just 8 yards per attempt. A part of that was by the design of D'Anton Lynn, though, and so that's where we'll start getting into this breakdown. To see what was going on in the first half, we don't need to go any farther than the first 2 plays of the game, where LSU had an easy time throwing short under Trojan cornerbacks who were giving up quite a bit of cushion. Here on play 1, we see LSU in an 11 personnel set with 1 running back, 1 tight end, and 3 wide receivers. Out of formations like this, in this game as well as in 2023, the Tigers want to have a strong spread rushing attack based around a lot of RPOs or run-pass option plays, where the quarterback has the option either to hand the ball off for a running play or to pull it and throw a pass, depending on how the defense lines up and reacts. Something that Denbrock in particular brought to the offense was a varied use of the tight end within this RPO attack. So, if we look at this guy right here, we see that LSU can keep him in the box as an extra run blocker, with the wide receivers on the outside working as the passing outlet for the quarterback. On the other hand, they can also get the tight end himself involved as the pass option on these plays, releasing him out into the flat while the offensive line continues to run block. This gives them a variety of ways to switch up their run game, taking advantage of different things that the defense might be doing with their alignment. When we look at USC's alignment against this formation, then, we have to understand that this is the kind of attack that they have to deal with. To do it, they're playing a nickel package with a 6-man box and a 5-man secondary. The basic idea here is for those 6 front defenders to outnumber LSU's 5 offensive linemen against the run, and then to use their nickelback as the tight end adjuster, lining him up outside of that guy. From that position, if the tight end stays in as a 6th run blocker, then the nickelback will just stay in the box as a 7th run defender. If, on the other hand, the tight end releases out wide to run a route, then the nickelback can widen with him, while the defensive front continues to outnumber LSU's 5 linemen in the box. The Trojans are then going to put 3 defensive backs over LSU's 3 wide receivers, leaving them with 1 more defensive back as a deep help player in the middle of the field. Tactically, a key point here is that when that safety is the only deep help player, and when he lines up in the middle of the field, the cornerbacks on the outside won't have any deep help behind them down the sidelines. That safety in the middle can't defend the whole field from sideline to sideline, and so the cornerbacks have to make sure that nothing can get deep behind them. To help them with this then, by the time the ball's snapped, we see that USC is asking those guys to play with a good amount of cushion, staying over the top and making sure that they're not giving up those deep shots that LSU was so good at last year. To sum up the key points of this defensive alignment then, the goal was to outnumber the Tigers in the box against the run, to use the nickelback as an adjuster for the tight end, whether he stayed into run block or released out into the RPO game, to defend the deep middle of the field with a free safety, and to protect the deep sidelines by playing their cornerbacks well off of their receivers. Early in the game against looks like this, LSU completed a lot of high percentage passes by going after that cushion on the outside, and to see that, we don't need to look any further than the first 2 plays of the game. This is play number 1. On this play, they're going to take their tight end and leave him into block. As we know, when he does this, the nickelback, who's the tight end adjuster, is going to stay on the edge to add in as a 7th run defender to match him. When he does this, though, it isolates the wide receiver up at the top of the screen against his cornerback, who's playing 8 yards deep at the snap. That receiver runs a quick hitch, the ball's out before he even completes his break, and he has time to gain some yards after the catch as a result. On the second play of the game, we'll see the same basic issue dressed up in a different way. This time, the Tigers are playing a 3-by-1 set with 2 wide receivers and a tight end down toward the bottom of the screen, and just a single wide receiver up at the top. Here, we see USC going with a very similar coverage structure to the last one. They have 3 defensive backs playing over LSU's 3 receivers, and then they're spinning one of their safeties down to be that tight end adjuster like we saw in the last play. With the 3 wide receivers and tight end covered by these 4 defensive backs, that then leaves them with their second safety free to be a deep help player in the middle of the field. It's not obvious from this pre-snap look, but after the snap, the Trojans are going to take this cornerback down at the bottom of the screen, and they're going to bail him out because remember, his only deep help is coming from that safety in the middle of the field, so there's nobody playing behind him down the sideline. After the snap, we see that guy start to bail, and we see him tilted to the inside with his eyes on the quarterback. Both he and the wide receiver are about to go off the screen, but we can see what's getting set up here. With the cornerback tilted inside watching the quarterback, the wide receiver is stemming into the blind spot behind him, and there the cornerback's going to lose track of him. LSU rolls the quarterback out to that side, and the wide receiver settles down in space underneath of the dropping corner. This soft spot in the flats didn't always show up in the same way or against the same coverage, but in the first half it's something that happened again and again and again. When we see that LSU had lower yards per attempt in this game than they did last year then, some of it's definitely related to the new personnel, but it's also a part of USC's game plan. Their primary goals were to make sure that they had numbers and matchups in the run and RPO game, and then to make sure that they didn't expose their defensive backs one-on-one down the sidelines. These soft spots and underneath coverage were what was still open after they'd done those 2 things. Of course, you can't give up those easy throws forever, especially when LSU was more than happy to take them, and so USC had to find ways to challenge these routes. A common sense response to this kind of situation is to assume that your best adjustment would be to play press man, to walk your cornerbacks up and aggressively take away that cushion. What Lynn illustrated in this game, though, was that this isn't the only answer, and in fact, sometimes going a little more passive in some areas of the field can actually make you more effective at challenging routes in the others. Here in the third quarter, for example, LSU has a 3rd and 3, and they're emptying out the backfield to try and use their quick passing game. On previous plays, we saw USC playing with just a single help player deep in the middle of the field. On this play, though, the Trojans are instead going to keep both safeties deep to play cover 2, which looks more passive in some ways, but which actually lets the cornerbacks be more aggressive in the flats. The apparently passive part of the coverage is that both of their safeties are deep help players, and in those positions, they'll divide the deep field into halves. When they go with this apparently more passive deep coverage, though, and when they give themselves safety help to both sides of the field, what they're actually doing is taking pressure off of the cornerbacks because they now have deep help behind them. With the safeties playing over the top, those guys are able to aggressively defend the short throws in the flats, and on this play, that ends up getting them off the field on third down. For various reasons, though, USC didn't want to run straight-up cover 2 very often in this game, and a big part of that was probably the LSU run and RPO game that I talked about earlier. We can see why on this play, where the Tigers are in their classic 11 personnel look, with 1 back and 1 tight end in the box, and 3 wide receivers split out wide. On the defensive side, we see USC playing with 2 safeties deep, much like on the last play. This leaves them with their 6 front defenders in this nickel look, along with our 5th defensive back, the nickelback, who's lined up in the box as the tight end adjuster. Here's where things get tricky, though. On this play, the Tigers are taking this off-the-ball receiver up at the top of the screen, and they're sending him in motion across the formation. This raises the question, who's going to cover that guy in the pass and RPO game? If your goal is to play cover 2, then you don't want to give up your 2 deep safeties, and you don't want to give up your cornerbacks in the flats. This means that the guy that's going to have to widen with that receiver will probably be your nickelback, who's lined up in the box over the tight end. What this does, though, is it puts the nickelback into conflicts. On the one hand, if you have him widen with the motion, then you're losing your 7th guy in the box. LSU can now use their tight end as a run blocker, and the defense will only have 6 defenders to match, so unless you change something else, you've lost your advantage in the run game. On the other hand, if you leave the nickelback in the box, then you have a problem with 2 wide receivers down at the bottom of the screen and just 1 cornerback in underneath coverage. That's the kind of thing that LSU could easily find a way to exploit, and for this reason, straight-up cover 2 wasn't a huge part of Lynn's game plan. This is where his pro-style background really becomes apparent, though, because what he ended up doing was using a variety of different zone structures that could still fundamentally take away the high percentage throws that we saw so often in the first half. Let's start with this play, where USC is showing a possible 3 deep fire zone coverage. This would be a zone coverage with 3 defenders in the deep zones, dividing the field into thirds, and usually, as they're showing here, those guys would be the cornerbacks and the free safety. In underneath coverage, then, they're showing a possible overloaded safety blitz off the edge coming from the top of the screen, which would leave just 3 defenders in the underneath zones. Here, those underneath defenders look like they'll be the 2 linebackers and the nickelback. Unlike most coverages then, which rush 4 and drop 7 into coverage, this look would rush 5 and drop 6, so this zone blitz is what I'm referring to by the term fire zone. If this is actually what the Trojans are running, then they're going to run into a familiar problem. With the safety blitzing off the edge, and with the cornerbacks bailing out to play the deep thirds, there's going to be a soft spot in each flat zone underneath of those bailing defenders. What they're actually doing, though, is rotating to a coverage called Cover 3 Cloud. In this case, the cloud label is telling us something about how they're going to cover the flat zones underneath and to the outside. Cloud starts with a C, and so it tells us that down at the bottom of the screen, a corner is going to roll down to play an underneath coverage and take away that zone. Meanwhile, the nickelback is going to bail out to replace him in the deep outside third. But what about at the top of the screen, where USC has a safety showing edge pressure? Well, in this case, that's just a disguise, because after the snap, he's going to drop out to defend the flat to his side. The cornerback behind him then will bail to his deep outside third, giving the Trojans a high-low bracket on LSU's receivers against anything that they might run to the sideline. In other words, the flats are covered, and their zone defenders playing over the top to take away anything vertical. On this play, we'll see a cousin of that look run out of a different disguise. It looks like the Trojans are showing maybe a quarter-half look, where the cornerback and safety at the bottom of the screen are dividing the deep field into fourths. While at the top of the screen, the cornerback seems to be playing in the flat, while the safety plays a deep half over the top, more like the cover 2 look that we saw in an earlier play. Now on this play, LSU's spreading the field with 2 receiving threats to each side and with wider splits than we saw in the last play, and against this formation, if USC were to run the same coverage in the same way, then they could get into trouble. This is where it becomes important to have a versatile, well-game-planned system of checks and responses to different offensive formations so that you can run the coverage shell that you want without being forced out of it by the offense's alignment. But let's back up a second. Why would USC get into trouble if they used the same rotation that we saw in the last play? Let's imagine that they kept everything the same. So to the short side of the field, they'd be bailing out their cornerback to play a deep outside third and dropping their safety down to show pressure before dropping into the flat. If they then drop their other safety back to play in the deep middle of the field, and then executed a cloud rotation with the cornerback at the bottom of the screen rolling up, and the nickelback dropping out to defend the deep outside third, then two things would be true. First, realistically, the nickelback would never be able to get over the top of the outside receiver if that guy's taking off straight down the sideline. Second, even if he did bail out fast enough to take away that threat, he'd be leaving the slot receiver all alone in a ton of space. So the three cloud rotation that we saw in the last play wouldn't really be viable against this formation. Fortunately for the Trojans, though, they have more than one way to get into a three cloud style coverage. To get that kind of look against this formation, they're running a variant called Cover 30 Cloud, which is going to rush just 3 men while flooding the underneath zones with 5 defenders. Again, this is a 3-deep cloud coverage, so the cornerback at the bottom of the screen is going to roll down to take away the flats. But then the rest of the deep coverage, instead of the nickelback, is going to rotate over toward him to defend the 3 deep zones. In underneath coverage, this rotation lets them leave the nickelback in position to play over the slot receiver, giving the Trojans an underneath defender to take away short routes by both of the receivers to the bottom of the screen. At the top of the screen, they're then buzzing the flat. Earlier I said that a cloud tag meant that a cornerback was playing in the flat, like we've seen on this play at the bottom of the screen. Well, the tag buzz starts with a B, and so it tells us that a backer is covering the flat to this side. If we watch number 13 then, we see that after the snap, he drops out to the sideline, where just like on the last play, he combines with the bailing cornerback to create a high-low bracket down the sideline. For good measure, USC is also running this as what I've called Cover 30. Cover 30 is still a 3-deep zone as we've seen, but the extra 0 here tells us that they're bringing just a 3-man rush and dropping 8 into coverage. With just 3 guys rushing the passer, they're going to drop defensive end Braylon Shelby to the inside hook zone, allowing the Trojans to flood the underneath coverage with 5 defenders and take away space against an offense that's trying to spread the field with 4 receiving threats. As I said in the opening, though, it wasn't the case that USC could just sit in one type of coverage and shut the Tigers down, as we'll see on this play. Here, the Trojans are running 30 cloud again, so the cornerback at the top of the screen is going to roll up to defend the flat. The rest of the secondary is going to rotate to a 3-deep zone behind him. And this edge player down at the bottom of the screen is going to drop out to defend the flat to his side, playing as the underneath man in those brackets that I've been talking about. To counteract this, though, the Tigers are going to run a play-action pass off of their favorite run-blocking scheme from this game, which was counter. LSU's use of this scheme and USC's techniques and assignments for defending it are what I talked about in my bonus film study on my Patreon page, so if you want to see how USC's run defense fit together with these coverage calls, you can head over to patreon.com/tcpfootball to check it out. The basic idea here is that LSU's playing with an off-the-ball tight end down at the bottom of the screen. From this alignment, they love to run counter, which will have that guy as well as the guard to his side pull across the formation to lead block for the running back. Immediately after the snap on this play, it looks like that's exactly what they're doing, so keep an eye on the left guard and tight end right after the play starts. If we pause it right here, we see that this play can look a lot like counter. The left guard's pulling across the formation, and the tight end has his hips turned inside as if he could be following him. What this does then is it triggers the Trojan linebackers to flow toward the top of the screen and to attack the line of scrimmage. It also holds up the edge player down at the bottom of the screen, preventing him from dropping out quickly to get into the flat. With those guys held shallow and in the box like this, LSU's just going to use the wide receiver at the bottom of the screen to run off the cornerback that's bailing to his deep third. And then they're going to drag their tight end across the field into the space that guy's vacating. Plays like this forced USC to find a way to defend the middle of the field with their secondary. They were doing a great job against the run, and so they wanted to let their linebackers play aggressively and attack the line of scrimmage like this, but they also needed to get defenders into that crossing route window, and so they had to turn to different coverages to find answers. One of the ways that they did this was with a variety of non-traditional Tampa 2 rotations, and that brings up the question, what's a traditional Tampa 2? Much like the cover 2, which we saw earlier, the Tampa 2 is going to play with both safeties over the top, dividing the field into halves, while the cornerbacks roll up to cover the flats. The difference between a classic cover 2 look and a Tampa 2 look, though, is that in the Tampa 2, someone, usually the middle linebacker, is going to drop out to defend the intermediate hole in between those two deep safeties. In this coverage, then, if a receiver runs something over the intermediate middle like we saw in the last play, that guy's going to be right there to take it away. Something that USC did pretty effectively against LSU then was to get into that basic structure, but they did it in some unexpected ways. On this play, for example, it looks like the Trojans are playing cover 3, with the cornerbacks bailing out to play the deep outside thirds, while the free safety drops to defend the deep middle. After the snap, though, they're going to rotate into something completely different. Down at the bottom of the screen, we're going to see the nickelback drop out to play a deep half like one of the safeties in cover 2, while the cornerback squats in the flat ready to take away that short outside zone. The free safety then is going to drop down into the intermediate hole, playing that position that would usually be filled by a middle linebacker in a traditional Tampa 2. From this position, he'll then be able to take away those intermediate crossing routes. If we think back toward the beginning of the video, though, I said that USC didn't want to play a ton of 2-deep coverages because of the disadvantages that they had against the run and RPO game. To avoid that weakness against the run then, although the Trojans are playing a Tampa 2 structure to the bottom of the screen, they're doing something a little bit different up at the top. To that side, they're going with a sky rotation, which you can also think of as a safety inversion. In a sky rotation, they're going to use a safety to cover the flat, and to put him in position to do this, they've had that guy walk up to play on the edge in the box. From that position, if that safety reads run, then he's going to stay on the edge as a 7th run defender. But if he reads pass, he's going to drop into the flat, while the cornerback bails to defend the deep half behind him, again creating that high-low bracket that we've seen Lynn building into several coverages now. On this play, that safety's drop to the flat leads to a poor throw and an incompletion. Again, though, no one coverage could take away everything, and LSU was still able to find their spots where they could exploit these non-traditional Tampas. Earlier, I talked about how the Tigers could use motion to create problems for USC's box defenders in the run and RPO game. We saw that on an earlier play, they could take this wide receiver up at the top of the screen and run him across in motion. The impact of this was that it put USC's box defenders into conflict. If you're the linebacker lined up to the motion side, do you chase that guy out wide and give up a number in the run game? Or do you stay in the box, potentially losing some coverage on the receivers to this side? USC's non-traditional Tampa 2 structure also gave them a great answer to that question. When the receiver motions across, the cornerback is going to cut to him, taking away anything that he might run out into the flat. When the cornerback picks up that receiver on his motion, it clears the linebacker of any responsibility for that guy, letting him stay in the box as an aggressive run defender. The nickelback then is going to bail out to play as a deep half defender over the top, while the field side safety drops into the intermediate middle hole, ready to defend one of those receivers if they happen to come back over the middle. This non-traditional Tampa 2 then gives USC a great structure for defending the kinds of things that LSU loves to do to this side of the field. Up at the top of the screen, though, the Tigers are going to do a nice job of exploiting that sky inversion that we saw in the previous play. Before the snap, we see that the cornerback's getting ready to bail out and defend deep half of the field, while the boundary safety is walked up on the edge, giving USC that 7th run defender in the box against the run, while also being ready to drop out into the flat against the pass. To attack this structure, LSU is going to use the lone wide receiver to this side of the field to go deep, running off the deep half cornerback. They're then going to give a light play-action fake to the running back, who's going to continue across the field before leaking out and running a wheel route down the sideline. But when he does this, who's going to defend him? Well, the deep cornerback has been run off by the wide receiver who's already gone vertical, and so it's going to have to be that safety that's playing in the flat. As we run this forward, keep an eye on that safety. After the snap, he sees that there's not much of a run fake, and so he turns and drops out into a short outside zone. As the running back releases out to this side, that safety gets his eyes back inside on him and prepares to run with him on the wheel. What this is going to do, though, is it's going to run off that safety, creating a new hole in the flat zone underneath of him. To get into that area, the Tigers are taking their tight end, who looked as if he was run blocking at the beginning of the play, and they're putting him on a delayed crossing route into that void where he's able to outflank the defense for a first down. While this non-traditional Tampa struggled against this concept, though, we've already seen that the Trojans could use their 30 cloud coverage to take away something very similar, showing how complementary these two coverages could be. On this play, which we looked at earlier, LSU put two wide receivers up at the top of the screen to the short side of the field, and then they ran both of them vertical, draining the cornerback and the linebacker to this side as they created their high-low bracket down the sideline. In cover 30, though, we saw that the defensive end of this side was dropping out to play as an eighth man in coverage, giving USC an extra defender to this side in perfect position to defend a shallow cross when it came over from the opposite side of the field. As we've also seen, though, these three cloud looks can then be susceptible to play action fakes thrown behind USC's aggressive linebackers, and so the cycle goes on and on. What all this goes to show, then, is that USC didn't have one magical call or tendency that they could use to shut down everything that the Tigers were trying to do. Instead, they played the odds. By taking away the flats, they were able to shut down the most common, most high-percentage throws that LSU was using to hurt them. Then, by having a variety of ways to take away those throws, they could keep the Tiger play callers and quarterback guessing. Sure, if LSU got into the right call against the right coverage, then they were more than capable of picking up yards. In fact, they did this a lot, which is why Nussmeier threw for more than 300 yards and completed 76% of his passes. By using a variety of coverage structures to force LSU's play callers to guess, though, USC was largely able to prevent them from getting into the kind of perfect play calls that could have led to big plays downfield. What's more, by playing zone and keeping everything in front of them, they were able to limit the gains when they did come. This forced LSU to move down the field with long, methodical drives, which usually stalled in punts or field goals, and that gave the Trojans just enough of an advantage to eke out a hard-fought 27-20 victory.